let's get started. This webinar is co-hosted by Vasil Machev, Microsoft MVP and Cloud Technology Strategist at Quadratec, and Greg Jones, who's a product owner for Autopilot and Public Folder Shuttle at Quadratec. So I'm going to hand over to them now, and I hope you enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Emma. Hi, everybody. So let's get started. So the idea of this webinar is to introduce you with the concept of administrative units in Office 365, also talking a bit more about how role-based access control can be achieved for Office 365 applications. And then in the second part of the presentation, we'll be showcasing a bit of a demo of a product that we are currently working on, which we believe will be very useful for organizations that have the need to actually use such role-based access controls for their Office 365 deployments. So basically, what's the content of this presentation? We'll start by explaining what the administrative units are. Then we'll talk briefly about how we can create and manage them. Then we can show some examples on how we can delegate access based on administrative use units, and what's let's say the latest in using administrative units is basically support for them in the Office 365 Admin Center. So we'll be doing a short demo on how this works currently in the Office 365 Admin Center. We'll then summarize by going over the pros and cons, the different limitations that AUs have, and then we'll just briefly mention some alternatives before passing it to Greg and talking about our own solution with it. So let's get started to basically set the stage here. What we've had traditionally in Active Directory for years and years now is managing our users and objects in general via the notion of organizational units. Sorry, I don't seem to be able to actually switch to full screen for whatever reason. Okay, I guess we can continue like this. Apologies. Anyway, so yeah, traditionally we are probably used to managing via organizational units. So, sorry, some slight interruptions here on the screen. Anyway, so traditionally on premises we have been managing via organizational units, but with the move to Office 365, unfortunately, we kind of lost this functionality because in general, Office 365 and the underlying Azure Active Directory don't have the notion of actual organizational units. Now, it's not just Office 365 or Azure AD. As most of you probably know, the different workloads that constitute Office 365, such as Exchange Online or SharePoint Online and so on, they actually have their own, let's say, on-premises ADs. They are own ADs which Microsoft is using to actually host the user objects and so on. And inside them, we do actually support organizational units, but the organizational unit structure in Exchange Online is a flat one. As you can see here on the middle screenshot, you can actually get this information for your Office 365 or Exchange Online organization, but you only have a single organizational unit, so it's this sort of flat hierarchy, and you only have one other, which is to house all these soft-delete objects in the tenants. Now, until recently, synchronizing even the information about which organizational unit on-premises object is in was not possible, but with the latest version of Active Azure AD Connect, this information can now be synchronized via the so-called on-premises distinguished name. It's actually the distinguished name that's synchronized, but we can use it to reconstruct the organizational unit for which a given object is part of. So this information can now be found in inside Active Directory, but reporting on this and using it in general, it's a bit complicated because, as you can see here on the other screenshot, the first one on this part on this slide is hidden inside this extension property. So it's not that easy to actually work with it in general in Azure AD. So because of this fact that Azure AD doesn't really support organizational units, We cannot go ahead and create organizational units in Office 365. We cannot go ahead and modify the existing ones or delete them and whatever. And the usual workaround that the organization have been using so far is to go ahead and use one of the extension attributes, and then based on those create either groups and add the users to them, or create management scopes which we can use for Exchange Online commandlets and so on. But a few years ago, basically, Microsoft made the first step of actually sort of presenting us with this replacement for for organizational units, the so-called administrative units. Technically,
Lucille, sorry to interrupt. I know you have a couple build slides coming up. Do you want to switch presenter rights to me and I can go full screen on the slides?
If you can, sure. Sorry, not sure what's happening with my. Okay. You should have this now, Greg, if you can. Okay.
And
okay, great. So keep in mind that you have to keep pressing. There's some animation.
yes, just tell me to change slides and I'll be happy to do it for you.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, if you can please go to the next slide now. So as I was saying, a few years back, Microsoft introduced this concept of administrative units, which is sort of intended to be the replacement or the analog of organizational units for Azure AD. However, in practice, they are more related to the actual notion of management scopes in Exchange RBAC. So we'll talk about this in more detail in a moment. But I wanted to emphasize here that administrative units are actually not that new to Office 365. They have been around for what's now 4 years already. Unfortunately, they are still actually mentioned as being in preview. If you open the Azure roadmap, Greg, if you can just press next, yep, and next again, thanks. If you just open the roadmap, you will see this screenshot which just appeared there on briefly. It's still show in preview. So for 4 years, we are still having them actually in preview. And the latest update that we've had on this roadmap is the actual support that we got for administrative units in the Office 365 portal, which happened at the end of last year. So for basically 4 years, there's practically nothing introduced there apart from this fact. And it's very, very slow process which Microsoft is undertaking. It was viewed at the time that administrative units were released that they were practically the first step of implementing RBAC controls to Office 365 in general, but unfortunately this hasn't happened yet. So anyway, let's talk about what exactly are administrative units. So they are not replacement for OU. They are more akin to management scopes, in meaning that you can actually use them to delegate permissions for a given role. And every user which is part of the administrative unit will be managed for a particular delegate, as we will see in a few more slides. So in order to be able to create and manage administrative units, you need to have Azure AD basic licenses for all the members, and for all the delegates, the users who will be granted permissions to perform various actions on these delegates, you actually need to have the Azure AD premium licensing. So one of the let's say cons that we have for administrative units in general is the added licensing that you need. If you can switch to the next slide, Greg, please. So how do we actually go ahead and manage administrative units? This is again one of the cons here because management is unfortunately only possible via PowerShell. Well, nowadays it's actually possible as part of the Graph API as well, but this is usually not something that the regular administrator for Office 365 will do. So both the old MS Online and the newer Azure AD PowerShell modules support working with administrative units, and I've presented some of the command lists here. If we go to the screenshot, if you can press next, Greg, you will see the actual command list listed there, and they are very simple command lists. So in order to actually create an administrative unit, all you need to do is issue the new -MS Online MSO administrative unit commandlet, and that's it. You don't actually have to specify any information about it. You don't need to specify a name or description or anything. It's a very simple process. I don't think anybody will actually have trouble going over it, so I haven't planned any demos for this. And there's also very extensive, well, not very extensive documentation. There is some documentation available online, but because all the examples there seems to cover the Azure AD module, instead in this presentation I've chosen to work with the older MS Online module, and all the examples that I will be presenting here are based on it. It's pretty much the same story with both modules, just different naming of the commandlets. So if we switch to the next slide, we'll show some examples on how we can actually create administrative units. Next slide, Greg, please. So I've gone ahead and created 3 different administrative units there. As I mentioned, we need to use PowerShell to actually create them, and in order to be able to run the commandlets, you need to be a global administrator. But there is no mandatory information that you need to provide. You simply issue the commandlet and that's it. If you don't specify a name will be automatically generated for the administrative unit, which is of course not a very good practice. So if you want to do things properly, you will specify a name and an actual description for it. So on the screenshot that we have on this slide, we have created several different administrative units and named them accordingly. You can enter anything you like for the name. It's not tied for there are no restrictions there. It's not tied to anything, so you can go as creative as you want. So in this case, I've created an AU for marketing, AU for our Bristol users, and AU for students, which is a scenario which might be very relevant to some of the organizations there in the educational sector. So this is how you go ahead and create the administrative units. And the next thing that you have to do actually after creating the administrative unit is to go ahead and populate the users for them. If we can switch to the next slide, Greg, please. So next slide. Okay, so there are no restrictions on who you can actually add as a member of administrative unit, and one of the differences compared to organizational units is that a single user can actually be a member of more than one administrative unit. So you can only add users. That includes the guest user objects, which some of you might already have in your Office 365 tenants, but you cannot actually add groups. There is currently a bug with the Azure AD PowerShell module, so if you use the commandlet to add administrative unit member via the Azure AD module, you can actually designate the an ID of a security group, and it will allow you to proceed. And later on, you can actually go ahead and see that the user is the group is being listed as a member of this administrative user. However, in practice, this doesn't actually work. None of the delegation actions that you can perform later on will apply to members of this group. So how do you actually populate a member of the group? It's done via the add MSO administrative unit member commandlet. Again, it's not very restrictive. You can add anybody you want. The problem with this, however, is that there are no ways to actually do the membership dynamically or based on some criteria, some filters and so on. You have to actually do it yourself. If you use the commandlet, you can only add one user at a time, but luckily with PowerShell you can of course automate things a bit. So on this example here we are showing how you can populate all the members of the marketing AU. So using the get MSO user commandlet, we have the built-in filter for the department attribute. So I've listed all the users which are members of the marketing department. And then I've used PowerShell to simply pass this list of users to the add MSO administrative unit member commandlet. And in effect, I've used this single line to populate the membership of this group. On the next example, we're doing things a bit differently because it's an example which uses the Office information for the users. Greg, if you can just press next. So For this particular attribute that we have, the Office attribute, we don't have any built-in filters for the get MSO user commandlet. So instead, we have to get all the users and use the client-side filtering. But because PowerShell is so robust, we can actually easily enough do this again. So I'm listing all the users from the Bristol office and again passing the output to the @MSO administrative unit member commandlet. As you can see, in this case, there are quite a few users there. But as a result of simply using this single commandlet, I'm still able to add them all as a member of the AU. And the last example that I have there is handling the membership for the students AU. But students, we don't have actually any easy way to designate. So I'm adding them one at a time, which is the basic example which you can see of usage of the commandlet. And this screenshot here illustrates that a user indeed can be a member of more than one administrative unit. Again, this is one of the differences compared to organizational units. Next slide, please. So basically, the administrative units are containers. You can create the administrative unit and populate the membership with the users you want to manage. And then what you have to do is actually delegate the management permissions to some delegate there, which will actually be performing various administrative tasks on those users. So in order to do this, you have to use, again, PowerShell. If you can press next, Greg, to just wall the slides. Yes, thank you. So again, only possible via PowerShell. The commandlet is listed there. There's the corresponding commandlet available via the Azure AD module, or of course, you can also use the Graph API. In all cases, it's not that really complicated, but in general, it might be something scary for a person who's first dealing with those. So it's important to understand that there is only 2 roles that you can actually delegate via this method. So when you are creating administrative units and using them to delegate administrative actions to, you can only use the user account administrator and the help desk administrator roles for Office 365. You cannot delegate, for example, global administrative permissions or any of the other like 20 or so roles that we currently have as part of Azure AD and Office 365. Some few remarks here as listed. So the actual delegate who will be performing administrative actions doesn't need to be a member of the AU. And the way that the actual delegation is done is that on the back end, the user is actually, every time this delegate will be performing various administrative tasks, either via PowerShell or via the admin tools and so on, there will be a check performed to see whether the user he's trying to edit is in the scope of this scoped role that we have just assigned to him. So the designation here is indeed a scoped role in comparison to the general roles that we have with Office 365. A scoped role is a role which is restricted to act only on users which are members of particular administrative units. So indeed, the actual commandlet that then you can use to create this association will need to get the information about who the delegate will be, who he will be able to work on, so which administrative unit we need to delegate to, and lastly, which is the role that he will be given. So if you press next, Greg, we'll see some examples on how you can actually do this. So first of all, the first commandlet there will show you that currently this user is not a member of any administrative unit. So as I mentioned, this is not mandatory. The second commandlet shows you that this user currently is not a member of any of the built-in administrative roles in Office 365. And the next commandlet simply lists our currently created administrative units. So in order to actually delegate permissions to Simon, in this case, to a particular organization, administrative unit, in this case, the Bristol administrative unit, we need the ID of the administrative unit, which is visible there. We need Simon's UPN or object ID. And lastly, we need the object ID of the administrative role to which he will be given granted access to. It's all unfortunately done in object ID format. So again, it can be a bit confusing to people who haven't done this so far, but as I mentioned, there is a documentation available from Microsoft, and you can just go ahead and use the examples there. There's actually a very detailed script which you can use to go ahead and set up a whole demo environment with both administrative units created, membership populated, and actual delegation done. So once you have actually issued the @MSO scoped role member commandlet to create this association between the administrative unit and the delegate, who will be given all those permissions on this set of users, you can use the commandlets then to actually verify that the process has been completed successfully. So because this is this type of scoped row, if you again issue the get MSO user row commandlet against Simon, you will see that he's still not listed as as member of any admin row. If you actually list the membership of the user management administrator role, which is the long GUID there, you can see that again Simon is not listed, but you can then use this get MSO scoped role member commandlet, which will actually show you that indeed Simon has been assigned these permissions on that particular administrative unit. Again, unfortunately, it's designated by the object ID, so it's not that easy to report on, but you can of course do some additional PowerShell commandlet execution and replace this administrative unit object with the actual name of the AU. And basically that's all there is to this model. You create the administrative units and populate the memberships in order to designate a scope on which administrative actions can be performed by a certain delegate. The delegate is then assigned to this administrative unit via the @MSO scoped role member commandlet. And the last thing that you need to do is to specify which admin actions he can actually perform on them. Once this is done, then you can log in with this user and perform various actions via PowerShell, or until recently, PowerShell was actually the only option available, but since the beginning of this year, the Office 365 Admin Center actually supports working with a scoped role. So on the next, sorry, not the next slide, actually I'll go ahead and do a short demo on how this all works in the admin portal currently. So Greg, if you can switch presenter to me, please. Okay, so let me see. Okay, let me know when you can actually see. Okay, hopefully you can guys see the screen now. So what I'm trying to do here is basically log into the Office 365 portal with this user, which we used to just delegate permissions to Simon. So I log in as regular. Once I'm logged in, oh well. I'll be taken into the landing page of Office 365, where I should now see the admin tile. Unfortunately, there seems to be a bug introduced recently via the portal. Even though I'm able to actually see the admin tile here, if I click on it, it doesn't seem to be taking me to the correct place. The correct place in this case should be the admin center, which will then present a limited set of commandlets, so a limited UI for the admin center. But as you can see here, it doesn't seem to be working even though the actual admin tile is displayed there. So instead, until Microsoft has actually fixed this bug, instead what you need to do is actually go ahead and open the the user page of the portal manually, and you can do this by pasting the following URL. So basically it's the portaloffice.com with this /users endpoint there. Now, because I have been granted access to this user management row as part of the the scoped row assignment, I'm actually able to log in with this user and get access to this part of the portal. I'm not sure if you noticed there, but the screen sort of flashed a bit while the portal was loading, and you probably saw a longer list of users, which was then trimmed to actually display only the users which are in the scope of this particular administrative unit that I am being currently assigned. So this user, actually I've gone ahead and created one more assignment. So this user, Simon, actually has been given two sets of permissions to two different administrative units. So for the Bristol administrative unit, we have the assignment for the user management administrator permissions. And for the students administrative unit, we have created a separate assignment with a more limited set of permissions, which is the help desk permission. So you can switch between those here, but first let me go ahead and show you how you can actually perform the exact same actions which you can do with the regular user management administrative permissions row. So if I select any user here, I will be giving the details for the user. Come on. And again, I have the regular interface here. I can just go ahead and, let's say, edit the username here, edit the product licenses or the location for the user, and so on. Now, if I switch to the other row, which is a bit more limited, so you can see that I'm still able to actually go ahead and select, but some of the interface items here are more limited. So I have the edit button missing here, for example, and I cannot go ahead and change some other stuff like the licensing information. Even though I do have the link to go ahead and view the licensing information, I'm greeted with the note here on top that I don't have enough permissions to actually go ahead and do so. So this is important. So you can realize here that Microsoft has done some work in the portal to make sure that no unprivileged access will be granted to such administrator who has been granted this scoped admin role. And this is even more important for scenarios where this user, Simon in my scenario, has been granted an actual unscoped role. Let's say if he has been granted the help desk administrator for the entire company, and then he will be actually able to see the full list of users here on this screen. But for any user who is not in the scope of this role, which allows him to actually do actions, he will be presented with this limited interface, and with even if he managed to get to one of the, let's say, more important parts of the interface, he will be presented with further restrictions there. So it's restricted on the user interface level, and there is another set of restrictions which basically runs checks on the backend every time you actually perform a commandlet. So in general, what I'm trying to say here is that it's safe enough to actually go ahead and delegate access via this method. So this is practically all that is new for administrative units for the past several years. They were introduced back in 2014. For 3 years, they were only manageable and working via PowerShell, so the delegate could only go ahead and log into PowerShell and perform various admin actions. And until from several months, we are actually able to leverage them into the admin portal. As I mentioned, there are still some bugs that need to be fixed, like the fact that the admin tab currently doesn't redirect you to this page, and you actually have to go to it manually, or the fact that the screen actually takes some refreshing to do, and so on. But other than that, it's pretty similar to the regular Office 365 admin interface, and you should have no trouble actually adapting to it. Simply some actions might not be available, or some users might not be listed because they are not scoped to any of the administrative units that the user has been delegated access to. And let's see, just to perform some action to see that it should actually work, I will go ahead and change the sign-in status for this user from blocked to allowed, and I should just be able to see the change happen immediately, like with any other administrator here. And yeah, that's pretty much all there is to it. So if I can actually manage to switch to the presentation now. Oops. Sorry. Okay. Sorry, I lost my switch control here for GoToWebinar. Okay, well, sorry, Greg, I'll switch to you as presenter again. And you can advance the slides, please. Yeah, let's just go. We've shown this slide already. So skip to the next, please. Continue, please. Yep, so this basically is a summary of what you can and cannot do with administrative units, where they can be useful, and what sort of limitations you will be facing with them. As you saw, they can be used to delegate some, not all, but some of the actions in the Office 365 portal, and securely enough, on a particular set of users, you can create multiple such sets by designating different administrative users for your different, let's say, departments or just groups of users inside your company, and use the scoped management roles to assign permissions to a particular delegate. Because of the recent improvements that we've seen, you can actually work with them with the admin portal, so they are not just limited to PowerShell, but when it comes to actually managing, creating, and working with administrative units in general, you can only do so via the relevant PowerShell commandlets or the Graph API, which might not be the best experience for you. It's also limited in terms of actions that you can perform, because only the roles that are supported for Office 365 in general, or Azure AD in general, can be delegated. Well, not all of them actually, but only the user management and the help desk. So if you want to delegate permissions to, let's say, part of SharePoint, you cannot actually use this functionality to do so. Exchange, of course, is way better in this regard. We've had the role-based access control there for years now, and it's actually more advanced than what we've shown here. So one of the alternatives that you might consider instead of using administrative unit is to actually leverage the Exchange role-based access control, because most of the stuff that you can edit for Office 365, like different attributes for the user, let's say his name, office location, and so on, most of them can actually be performed via the corresponding Exchange commandlets. So in terms of alternatives of using administrative units, this is one of the recommendations I can give you. Try to explore the Exchange role-based admin control. There are also some third-party products which can give you more robust experience in this. And what we want to show you in the next part of this presentation is our own product, Quadrotex Autopilot, and how it can help you with this issue in general. So let's switch over to Greg.
Thank you very much, Vasil. So Autopilot ties into the AU discussion very easily. That's very similar concepts of placing users into containers and then delegating rights to those containers. Obviously, there are some limitations that you've seen by using AUs, and we don't have any of those limitations with Autopilot. So let me just talk about a high-level view of what Autopilot is first. It is a SaaS-based solution that runs in Azure, and it's essentially a proxy between an Office 365 user / delegated administrator / administrator and the Office 365 platform. It brings the idea of organizational units and the ability to group users into a container or into an organizational unit to an Office 365 tenant. Once we've gone through the process of creating the organizational unit structure and delegating individuals' rights to do things within Autopilot, it determines the actions are allowed for that end user. So very much like you saw with the demonstration that Vasil did, and there being checks to make sure that the end user actually has these rights. We do the same thing with an Autopilot to make sure that nobody has rights that we've not defined specifically within the product. And finally, Autopilot will manage both on-premise systems and Office 365 through the same console. So if we have a situation where you have a local Active Directory that's using Azure AD Connect to synchronize users into Office 365 or Azure AD, we can manage those users on-prem. So we can update those fully and change someone's, or delegate the ability to, change someone's phone number or whatever that might be that needs to be initiated with within the on-prem Active Directory environment. Some of the key benefits for Autopilot, again, we're using the concept of grouping or containers or organizational units in Office 365 for administration. We offer multi-tenant support, so for larger organizations that are out there that have, for one reason or another, they have been put into a position where they have multiple tenants to support, whether that's merger and acquisition or they were just too big for a single tenant. Whatever that might be, we do offer multi-tenant support. It also works for service providers as well. So if you are managing Office 365 for smaller companies and you're offering that level of support, we can, again, provide that multi-tenant support for you. We have the concept of standardization of users based off of these containers that we're creating. So if I create a container, and I'll show you this example here in probably a little bit, if I create a container for Bristol, for all the Bristol users, I might have city equals Bristol for all of those users, things like that. So making those standardization of attributes based off of the container. Again, we offer the on-premises Active Directory support. We also span workloads. So it's not just Office 365, Azure Active Directory, it's Exchange Online, and other workloads as well within Office 365. We also have license management, so we can delegate out the ability to manage licenses. And finally, there's a self-service administration component where you can have the end users update whatever you'd like to have them update based off of the delegations. Key features, we do very granular administration for the on-premise Active Directory and Office 365 users, again, within the same console. So it's not here's a kind of a default template that you get. It's here you can update the user and you can see these 6 attributes and only update 2 of them. So we get very granular as far as these policies are concerned. The administrative rights that we're delegating can be done in a single tenant or across multiple tenants, which is a big benefit for those that have multiple tenants that they're managing. This is going back to the benefit of having standardization. So if we have a container for the sales department, we can have their department equal sales. We can also then maybe assign them rights to a shared mailbox for the sales department, maybe also grant them a Dynamics license, have that all happen just by putting somebody into the sales virtual organizational unit. That's the automatic assigning of licenses, shared resources. I just talked about a shared mailbox. So this 3 bullet points there I just talked about with the standardization. Letting Autopilot decide where a change needs to happen. So from my point of view, if you have a local Active Directory that is being synchronized with Azure AD, and you have to update your users or the synchronized users on-prem, but you also have some cloud users that also are part of the organization and they're cloud only, we can update those there. I don't need for you or whoever you're delegating your administrative rights to have to understand that, okay, this is an on-prem user, so I have to update it on-prem, or this is a cloud-only user, so I have to update it in the cloud. They're just shown as a user within the user interface. And when someone's been delegated rights to update those, they get updated where they need to be updated. And then finally, let architects be architects. So the idea of global admin and those that need global admin only having global admin is very important here, but that can then also impede those people that have global admin from providing the functionality that they're providing as a role within the organization. So it might be that only my architects or only my top level engineers are global admins. Well, that means that if someone needs multi-factor authentication turned on, I have to be notified to do that because I'm the only global admin. The other alternative is I give global admin to a lower level that may make changes that I don't want them to make. So there's a balance there. And what we're trying to do with Autopilot is, again, reduce the amount of global admins that you are required to have and be able to delegate those rights to anyone within the organization that you deem necessary to have those rights, and not have to have any additional rights with native rights within Office 365. And that frees up your top level engineers or your architects to do the things that they're meant to do, like trying to figure out how we're going to move the organization from Skype for Business into Teams, or how we're going to get rid of the on-prem Exchange infrastructure completely. Whatever that might be that they need to actually do, and not be enabling somebody's multi-factor authentication or resetting something like that. All right, so just some comparisons with what Vasil was talking about with what Autopilot does. It's a similar concept, but we're a lot easier to implement. So from an AU perspective, you might create AUs. With an Autopilot, it's just a new organizational unit. Within the interface, we click New Organizational Unit, we're done. We can also, if you have a local Active Directory, import the OU structure from that local Active Directory. There's no need for a global admin. We can easily create these organizational unit structures within the UI. Moving users to an organizational unit is very easy with an Autopilot. It's a simple click a user move versus doing that within PowerShell and all the GUIDs and everything that were part of that. And no need for AAD premium whatsoever. So that's a cost savings across the board. From a delegation perspective, when you're delegating access, you know, as Vasil mentioned, there's really just the two roles that you can assign. Within Autopilot, we can get very, very granular with not only the roles that we're granting, but we can also get very specific as far as what you can do within those roles. Again, this is not just an Azure Active Directory delegation. We can deal with user management, obviously. We can deal with license management. We can deal with the Exchange Online, OneDrive for Business, Teams, those type of things. And again, no need for PowerShell. From an architecture perspective, I mentioned before that we do run within Azure. We're running in Service Fabric within Azure, which in itself leads to resiliency because it's spread across multiple data centers. So we don't have to worry about, you know, an instance going down. It can just fail over to the other instance that's running. So within Service Fabric, there's the concept of microservices. We have a few microservices. We have the front-end web interface, user interface that is the front end of the product. The back end of the product, we have a couple different microservices. There's the core. That core is the brains of the operation. It contains all of the information that we have, all of the policies that are there. We have two different types of policies: authorization policies, which provide the role-based access control, and we have configuration policies, which do the standardization based off of the container. And then we have the approval. So who has been delegated rights to do this, and we make sure that they've actually been delegated rights to do these things. And then finally, we have the actions. And those actions are the specific things that you can do. So that might be, you know, updating a user. It might be granting permissions to a shared mailbox. It might be enabling an archive mailbox or disabling an archive mailbox, adding a license. Those are all actions. And we can take those actions and put those into an authorization policy and then apply that authorization policy to a person to be able to actually make modifications. So let's say that I have Vasil and I put him into an authorization policy against the container that I'm in. And I say Vasil can update my phone number. Vasil, again, doesn't need to know if I'm an Active Directory on-prem user or an Azure Active Directory user. He just sees my object, he updates my phone number, and then what happens is the core will send that change to the agent controller. The agent controller will say, okay, I know that Greg, his account is a cloud-only account. I'm updating the phone number, so I'm going to use the Graph API agent to do that. And I can update the phone number for that user in Office 365 Azure AD and make that happen. Or if I was an on-prem Active Directory user, it would say, okay, well, I need to send that command over to the on-prem agent and update the Active Directory user within the on-prem environment and allow the Azure AD Connect to synchronize that object up to Office 365. So we can make changes, again, on-prem via PowerShell. We have the PowerShell agent for Azure and Office 365 for anything we can't do via Graph. And then we also have the Graph API agent that we try to primarily utilize unless there's not functionality there for us to perform that action. All right, so let's jump into a demo. All right, so I am in Autopilot as an administrator at the moment. And the first thing you see when you come in is a view of a dashboard that shows you activity over the last 10 minutes. If you have configuration policies applied, how many of the users within those configuration policies are compliant. So if somebody's not, you'll see a red piece of bar here that you would see the users. I see license information, I see tenant information, job information as far as what's been completed or what's been an error. But really where the functionality comes in is coming in and creating organizational units, moving people into organizational units. So I can come in here and, say, create a new organizational unit for Germany and maybe do Hamburg. So we can save Hamburg. Now I have a OU here for Hamburg. I can move people into that. And once I have this organizational unit or virtual organizational unit structure set up, or I've imported my organizational unit from my local Active Directory, then I can go into create policies. So again, authorization policies are role-based access control. Configuration policies provide standardization. So let's look at authorization policies. So I have an OU, France OU auth policy here. I'm going to show you what we're doing with that. So basically, we're setting it against an organizational unit. So I have this against the France organizational unit. I'm assigning rights to Emily. Emily is going to have the rights to the people within that organizational unit. I have actions. So these are the things that I'm allowing Emily to do against the users in that OU. And then finally, based off of these actions that I've put in here, then I have some very specific properties of those actions that I'm either allowing Emily to see or edit. There's some mandatory ones, but I can go through and say, Emily does not have the right to even see the mobile phone attribute, but can see job title and actually update that, can see department and update that, can see country, but is not allowed to update country. So we can get very specific with our roles and who we apply those to, so they can do exactly what their job requires them to do, and again, nothing else. And if we're concerned about privacy regulations and personal information, things like mobile phone, we don't want to show to anyone, we can remove that. Okay, so that's going to be an authorization policy against the France OU. Let me go switch quickly to configuration policies. Again, these are going to provide some sort of standardization. So if I look at my France policy here, again, for my config policy, I can see I have it applied to my France OU and also my Lyon OU. As far as action is concerned, what I'm saying is anybody in one of those OU, I need their department to equal France. And I think I also have set down here, the usage location also gets set to FR. So if I want to change that for some reason that this is changing from France up to Germany, just to show you what it would do, I could do this. Again, it wouldn't make sense, but I can then change all of the users in the France OU and the Lyon OU to their country equaling Germany. Now, when I delegate the rights, let me show you what it looks like. So I am logged in here with Emily. And again, if you notice within the portal here, we don't have any additional admin rights. Emily is just a standard Office 365 user. However, when I go into Autopilot, she'll get a different view of the interface from Autopilot. So we're not going to see any of the policies that are being created. We're not seeing any of the audit logs or anything like that. All we're seeing is what Emily has access to. So just to begin with, she sees her own information. If this was simply self-service, you would not even see the organizational units here. All you would see is your own information and what you could update, or what we've allowed you to see and what we've allowed you to update. From an organizational unit perspective, she's only going to see the organizational units that she has rights to. In this case, it was the France OU and 3 OUs, sub-OUs to France. And within those, she could go look at the users, take a look at Pam, and see Pam's information. If she needed to go through and reset a password, she could do that. We could have her enable multi-factor authentication. We could have her deal with licensing. I've delegated these rights. So I could assign individual pieces of a service plan to these users. Let me just go ahead and make a quick edit. So let's say that we're going to change the city from Redmond to Paris. So I can save that. When I save a job, you'll see that the job was scheduled. And then we also get a notification that the job is running. Once the job is completed, that will go away. We'll see that this has been changed from city of Redmond to Paris. Okay, so pretty straightforward. And again, this is not just changing user attributes. It could be assigning rights to a shared mailbox, or adding an archive mailbox, or permissions on a calendar. All of those type of things we can delegate. So if I go back to my administrative view, I can then see that in my audit log what has actually happened. So we see Pam here, and we can see that Emily updated Pam's object and changed the city from Redmond to Paris. Earlier in the day, again, Emily changed Patty, department, from nothing, there was nothing in the department, to sales. So we're able to see all of these things happen. So if I go ahead and change this to completed. Even with our configuration policies, as they run every hour, we'll be able to see that the system actually updated an entire OU of things to, like I said before, from a configuration policy, I went from France to Germany, I believe. Within a little while, all of those will start to show up in the audit log here, from the changes, from the country equaling France to country equaling Germany. All that again in the audit log. So it's a who, it's a what, it's a from where, and who did it. So just to wrap up here, we've also thought about this from multi-tenant support. So I can go through and manage multiple tenants. If I need to add in, 10 tenants that I manage, I can come in here, go ahead and add a tenant, provide it with the credentials for that tenant, and then have those tenants, again, in my organizational units show up as a top-level organizational unit. So I have tenant 1, tenant U, tenant 2, and underneath there, I might have a completely different organizational unit structure for that individual tenant. But from a policy perspective, if I wanted to grant Emily access to this second tenant to do something in HR, I could do that and expand the tenants as well. So we're coming up on the top of the hour, and I think I'm done. So I guess we can ask for any questions that might be out there.
Yes, thank you, Greg. There are actually a few questions from David here.
Emma, are you available?
Can you hear me, Greg?
I am indeed. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So we've got a few questions. I'll run through these. Can Autopilot apply to delegate permissions for CSP? That is, can I create a scoped admin role for a CSP admin that restricts the admin rights they have in our customer tenants?
So I guess the answer to that is yes. So that's that's what we're doing. So it's not really, I guess, a scoped role as you would consider it within the AU concepts, but we are creating these authorization policies that allow us to get very granular with what we're able to do delegations about.
Cool. Next question is, and does Autopilot's license management work for CSP partners as well?
Yes.
That was an easy one. How are on-prem changes executed within Autopilot?
So we have the on-prem agent that's installed within, it's going to be on a member server in the domain where the Active Directory objects live. When a job is submitted for a user that is an on-prem user, that change will be sent to the on-prem agent, and that on-prem agent will actually make the change to the end user and then wait for the synchronization to happen back to Office 365. That on-prem agent, when you install it, first of all, I guess it talks over SSL, and there's also a token associated with each individual agent, so we can verify that individual agent has been registered with the application, and that's the one that's we're able to use. So there's a lot of security involved with that as well.
Cool. And finally, is the on-prem agent required for synced AD or optional?
So it's optional. However, if you want to update any objects that are in sync, or have the option to delegate the option to update any user objects that are in sync, you would need the on-prem agent. You would be able to see the users if you were just using Exchange Online. You'd be able to, run Exchange tasks against those users, but you wouldn't be able to update those users as far as their phone number or department or things like that if you didn't have the on-prem agent installed and they were synchronized.
Great, and that's all the questions that we have. So I think let's wrap up there. Thanks everyone for their time. And as we mentioned before, there'll be a copy of the recording available after the webinar. We'll send it out to you in an email. So thanks everyone.
Thank you.